Picture this. It's 1943, the world is burning. Millions are dying on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific. And in a nondescript brick building in Arlington, Virginia, a small group of American cryptanalysts sits hunched over desk after desk, staring at strings of numbers that look absolutely meaningless. But here's the thing that keeps you awake at night. If you're one of these codebreakers, those numbers aren't random. They're messages. Soviet messages. Secret Soviet messages sent between Moscow and their operatives embedded deep inside the United States government itself. And nobody in power knows these Americans are reading them. Not the president, not the Secretary of State, not anyone. What if I told you that for 50 years, America's most powerful intelligence operation was kept so secret that even the sitting President of the United States had no idea it existed? Welcome to the Venona Project. But this isn't some dusty historical curiosity gathering cobwebs in forgotten archives. This is the story of how a secret that shaped the entire Cold War was hidden so carefully that it rewrote history itself. It's about spies in the highest offices. It's about betrayal that cut so deep it fundamentally changed what it meant to be American. And it's about the technological breakthrough that made it all possible. A breakthrough so sophisticated that most people couldn't understand it, even if you explained it for hours. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why the Rosenbergs died. You'll know why Senator McCarthy wasn't crazy, even though we've been taught to laugh at him. And you'll see how the fabric of American security was so thoroughly penetrated that it took a secret 50 years in the making to even begin to comprehend the scope of the danger. The question isn't just what happened. The question is, how did America survive? It's December 1941. Pearl Harbor has just been attacked. America wakes up to the terrifying reality that it's not invincible. The Japanese have proven that. And now the nation needs allies. The Soviet Union, despite being communist, despite Stalin's murderous regime killing millions of his own people, becomes America's ally against Hitler. It's a marriage of convenience born from desperation. Winston Churchill would later say something like, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." That's the logic here. So, American money flows to the Soviet Union. American weapons flow to the Soviet Union. American military secrets flow to the Soviet Union because they're on the same side against Nazi Germany, right? But what America didn't understand, what the American government refused to believe, was that Stalin had no intention of honoring any alliance. Stalin was playing a game that went far beyond defeating Hitler. He was positioning the Soviet Union to dominate Europe when the war ended. And to do that, he needed intelligence. He needed to know what Americans were thinking, what they were planning, what weapons they had, what their military capabilities were. And most importantly, he needed to know what agreements they were making with the British. So, Stalin did what Stalin always did. He sent spies. Not just a few spies, not a handful of operatives, but scores of agents, KGB officers, GRU military intelligence officers, and most dangerously, recruited Americans. Americans who believed in the communist cause. Americans who had been radicalized in the universities and coffee shops and political movements of the 1930s. Americans who genuinely believed they were helping to build a better world. Some of them were ideological zealots, others were blackmailed. Some were seduced by the promise of money or power. But all of them had one thing in common. They had access to American secrets, and they were willing to betray their country to give those secrets to Moscow. These spies weren't working in the shadows of enemy territory. They were walking through the corridors of the State Department. They were sitting in offices at the War Department. They were analyzing intelligence at military installations. They were advising the president. And here's the problem that keeps intelligence officials up at night. The American government didn't know they were there. Oh, sure, there was suspicion. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had some awareness that Soviet espionage was happening, but they didn't have proof. They didn't have evidence that would hold up in court. They had hunches and rumors, and intercepted information that was so fragmented and encrypted that it might as well have been gibberish. So for years, from 1941 through the early 1940s, American secrets flowed to Moscow, and the American government was essentially blind to it, until someone had an idea that would change everything. The idea was simple in concept, but staggeringly complex in execution. What if, the codebreakers asked, we could break the Soviet cipher? What if we could decrypt these messages and see exactly what Moscow knew? What if we could identify the spies? The problem was that the Soviet cipher system was believed to be unbreakable. It was called the one-time pad system. Mathematically, if it was used correctly, it was supposed to be impossible to crack. The Nazis couldn't crack it. The British couldn't crack it. Nobody thought the Americans could crack it. But America had something nobody else had. It had people. Brilliant, obsessive, dedicated people who were willing to spend years staring at encrypted messages, looking for patterns that shouldn't exist. What if one of those patterns was actually the key to the entire Soviet spy network? Chapter 2. The Breakthrough's 400 words. The story of how Venona actually began is less dramatic than you might think, which makes it more interesting. It starts in 1943 with a traffic analyst named Cecil Phillips. His job was to look at Soviet communications traffic, not to decrypt them necessarily, but to identify patterns. Who was sending messages? Who were they being sent to? When were they being sent? What was the volume? By studying the metadata, Phillips began to notice something odd. Some of the Soviet messages appeared to be using the same key as other messages. In theory, this shouldn't happen. The Soviet one-time pad system was supposed to generate a unique key for every single message. No repeats, no overlaps. But here they were. Now, you need to understand what this means in the language of cryptography. If two different messages are encrypted with the same key, you can compare them mathematically. You can begin to extract information. It's like if I gave you a lock and told you it was unbreakable, but then I used the same lock for two different safes. The fact that the lock is the same becomes a vulnerability. Phillips brought this observation to his supervisor, Jean Grable, a brilliant woman who had been doing cryptanalysis work since before the war. Grable understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just an interesting observation. This was potentially the crack in the wall that nobody thought existed. What if the Soviets had made an operational security mistake? They had. And it would eventually expose the entire Soviet spy network in America. But here's where it gets complicated. Breaking the cipher wasn't like in the movies where someone sits at a desk for a few hours and suddenly the code pops open. This took years. It took literal thousands of hours of work. It took mathematicians and linguists and people who understood Russian. It took people like Meredith Gardner, a young woman who would become the intellectual driving force behind the project. Gardner was a natural linguist. She spoke Russian fluently. She had a mind that could see patterns where others saw only noise. And she had the kind of stubborn dedication that makes great code breakers. When everyone else wanted to give up, Gardner kept working. The progress was agonizingly slow. In 1943, they could maybe break a few words out of entire messages. In 1944, maybe a few sentences. In 1945, they were beginning to see entire passages. And then, in 1946, a message came through that made everyone stop in their tracks. The message was from the Soviet consulate in New York. It mentioned, in plain Russian text, the names of American scientists working on the atomic bomb project. And Moscow knew about them. What if the Soviets had a spy inside the Manhattan Project? They did, and this realization sent shockwaves through the American intelligence community. The codebreakers realized they weren't just looking at routine diplomatic cables or military communications. They were looking at evidence of the largest espionage operation in American history. Thousands of messages, hundreds of spies. Information flowing from the most sensitive projects in America directly to Moscow. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Yes, the people at Venona, the code breakers, the analysts, the people who understood what they were actually reading. They wanted to tell someone. They wanted to expose what they'd found. They wanted to identify the spies and stop them, but they couldn't. Because if they told anyone, if they revealed what they knew, the Soviets would figure out that their cipher had been broken. And if the Soviets figured out that their cipher had been broken, they would change it. And if they changed it, Venona would go dark. The American government would lose its window into Soviet operations. So the codebreakers did something that must have been agonizing for them. They kept quiet. They kept working. They kept reading messages about spies operating in America. They kept finding evidence of treason. And they told almost nobody. This wasn't the kind of secret that could be kept in the normal channels. The codebreakers understood that if they told the FBI would want to investigate and prosecute. If they told the State Department would want to take action. Any action would expose Venona. So the secret was kept in the most compartmentalized way possible. The codebreakers knew. Their immediate supervisors knew. Maybe a handful of people in military intelligence knew. That was it. For years, possibly decades, the American government possessed evidence of Soviet espionage and couldn't act on it. Chapter 3. The Hidden Spies 1400–100. Words. Now let's talk about who these spies actually were. Because this is where Venona goes from being an interesting historical footnote to being genuinely spine-chilling. He was an electrical engineer with communist sympathies. He worked on military projects. He had access to sensitive information, and according to Venona intercepts, he was actively recruiting other spies and passing information to Moscow. But Julius wasn't the only Rosenberg involved. His wife, Ethel Greenglass Rosenberg, was also implicated. She was typed in the intercepts as being part of the spy ring. And then there was her brother, David Greenglass, who worked at Los Alamos, who had access to atomic bomb information. When you read the Venona messages about these people, the real, actual decrypted Soviet intercepts, you're reading descriptions of real treason, real betrayal. Moscow had code names for these people. The Rosenbergs were Liberal and Asta, depending on the message. David Greenglass was Caliber, and the information they were stealing wasn't trivial. We're talking about the design of the atomic bomb. We're talking about American military capabilities. We're talking about the names and locations of other American agents working for the Soviet Union. Ethel Rosenberg's involvement was particularly significant because it meant that the Soviet spy ring had penetrated not just military and scientific circles, but had also recruited people based on family connections and personal relationships. Ethel had been brought into the operation through her brother. The Rosenbergs had recruited friends and acquaintances. This was a network. This was a comprehensive, systematic infiltration of American institutions. But the Rosenbergs were just the beginning. There was Donald MacLean, who worked in the British Foreign Office and was passing information to Moscow through Soviet handlers. He had access to some of the most sensitive diplomatic cables in the world. He knew what Britain was planning. He knew what America and Britain were discussing together, and he was telling Moscow everything. There was Guy Burgess, another British diplomat who was also a Soviet agent. Burgess was so brazen, so confident in his position, that colleagues later said they were amazed they didn't realize he was a spy earlier. But that's how good Soviet recruitment was. They found people with access, people with ideology, people with weaknesses, and they turned them. There was Kim Philby, the British intelligence officer who was running Soviet operations in the Middle East. Philby was so high up in British intelligence that he was essentially running counterintelligence operations against Soviet spies, while simultaneously being a Soviet spy himself. He was hunting his own people. And then there were the Americans. Al Jahis, the the State Department official who was present at Yalta when Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to decide the future of Europe. Hess was allegedly passing information about American diplomatic positions to Moscow. Think about that for a second. One of the key American diplomats shaping the post-war world was potentially a Soviet agent. Harry Dexter White, the Treasury Department official who was instrumental in creating the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. He was in the room for discussions about American economic policy, American financial strategy, and American plans for the post-war world. And according to some Venona evidence, he may have been compromised by Soviet intelligence. The list goes on and on and on. What if the American government's most important decisions during the most critical moment in world history were being shaped by Soviet intelligence operatives? This is the context that Venona reveals. This is the scope of what was actually happening. Now, you might be wondering why we don't know about all of this more clearly. Why is the history of this period so confused? Why did some of these people's names become famous and others disappeared from public memory? The answer lies in what happened next. Chapter 4. The Rosenberg Case 2020-800. Words. The Rosenberg case became the public face of Venona, even though Venona itself remained classified. Here's how it happened. In early 1950, the British discovered that their cipher had been broken. They realized there was a Soviet spy in their foreign office. They began an investigation and eventually identified Kim Philby. But before they could move against Philby, he fled to the Soviet Union. His disappearance created a domino effect. British intelligence began questioning why Philby had fled. They realized he must have been warned. Someone must have told him the British were closing in. That someone, they discovered, was Guy Burgess. And Burgess was connected to Donald Maclean. And somehow, word that British intelligence was hunting Soviet agents got back to Moscow through these channels. Meanwhile, the Americans realized that the Soviets now knew their cipher had been broken. If Venona was going to be useful going forward, they had to start using it to catch spies before the Soviets changed their procedures to prevent further compromise. So the decision was made to act. But they couldn't act directly on Venona evidence because that would reveal the project. So they had to find another way. They had to catch these people through conventional investigation and interrogation. The first person they focused on was Julius Rosenberg. The FBI knew about Julius through their investigation of Harry Gold, a Soviet courier who had been caught passing information to Moscow. Gold had mentioned meeting with an American engineer and military men in New Mexico. Gold's description matched Julius Rosenberg. So on June 17, 1950, the FBI arrested Julius Rosenberg. What followed was one of the most controversial trials in American history. The prosecution's case was based on the testimony of David Greenglass, Ethel's brother, who described how Julius had recruited him into the spy ring and how David had stolen information from Los Alamos and passed it to Julius, who then passed it to Soviet handlers. Greenglass testified that Julius told him that the information David stole was helping the Soviet Union, and that by stealing atomic secrets, they were helping to prevent a Third World War. The Rosenbergs maintained their innocence. Julius denied everything. Ethel denied everything. But the evidence, as presented at trial, seemed overwhelming. David's testimony was damaging. Harry Gold's testimony placed Julius at a meeting with a Soviet handler. The circumstantial evidence built and built. What if Ethel Rosenberg was actually innocent? This is one of the historical questions that Venona helps answer, in a way that's actually more troubling than the original verdict. The Venona decrypts that mention Ethel appear to indicate that she was aware of her brother's activities, and possibly Julius's activities, but they also might indicate that she wasn't actively engaged in espionage herself. There's an ambiguity in the Soviet intercepts that's been debated by historians for decades. But Julius's involvement is much clearer in the Venona materials. He was actively recruiting. He was actively passing information. He was a conscious, committed Soviet agent. Ethel's level of involvement was less clear. She may have been primarily a spy's wife. involved in the apparatus, but not necessarily actively stealing secrets. But in 1951, the jury didn't know about Venona. They didn't know about the decrypted Soviet messages. They only knew what was presented at trial. And what was presented at trial was enough to convict both Julius and Ethel of conspiring to commit espionage. The judge, Irving Kaufman, was furious about the case. He believed they had committed an act that was more grievous than murder. In his sentencing statement, he said that by stealing atomic bomb information for the Soviet Union, they had substantially increased the chances of Soviet success in a surprise atomic attack on America. They had, in his view, contributed to a war that might kill millions of Americans. So, on June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed. The executions sent shockwaves through America. The left protested, claiming they were victims of McCarthy-era witch hunts. The right pointed to the executions as proof that communist espionage was real and posed a genuine threat. What both sides didn't know was that Venona confirmed the worst fears of the right. The Rosenbergs had been part of a massive Soviet spy operation. They hadn't been invented by paranoid anti-communists. They were real, and they had given real information to the Soviet Union. But the fact that Venona was secret meant that the debate about the Rosenbergs became detached from the actual evidence. Instead of debating whether the Rosenbergs were guilty based on classified decryptions of Soviet messages, the debate became abstract. It became about ideology and politics. What if America had been able to publicly debate the Rosenbergs' guilt based on the actual Venona evidence? Perhaps the debate would have been more grounded. Perhaps people would have understood the actual scope of Soviet espionage. Or perhaps the revelation of Venona would have been so shocking that it would have validated every accusation made by anti-communist figures in the 1950s, potentially leading to even worse outcomes. The secret nature of Venona meant that the case that should have been the ultimate validation of concerns about communist infiltration instead became ambiguous and controversial. Chapter 5. The Scope of the Operation. 2,800, 3,500. Words. When the Venona Project finally declassified some of its findings in the 1990s, researchers discovered that the Soviet Union had successfully recruited somewhere between 200 and 300 American citizens who were actively passing information. 200 to 300 people, not including the British spies, not including spies in other Allied nations, just Americans. Americans with access to American secrets passing information to Moscow. These people weren't all working together in one big conspiracy. Instead, they were organized into separate cells, each cell usually controlled by a different Soviet handler. Some cells were focused on military information, others were focused on diplomatic information. Some cells were specifically tasked with infiltrating intelligence agencies themselves. One of the most shocking cells was the one that had infiltrated the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was America's wartime intelligence agency and the predecessor to the CIA. There were Soviet agents inside American intelligence. Think about that. The organization that was supposed to catch Soviet spies had been compromised by Soviet spies. It's like having a security guard who's actually working for the burglar. One of the famous cases involving an OSS employee was that of Duncan Lee, a Yale-educated lawyer who worked as an assistant to General William Donovan, the head of the OSS. Lee had access to cables from OSS stations around the world. He knew about American intelligence operations in Europe and Asia, and he was passing information to Moscow. The Venona decrypts show that Moscow had complete confidence in Lee's access. They were eager to have him continue his work because they were getting high-quality intelligence from him. And Lee didn't work alone. There were other OSS employees who were also compromised. There was Donald Wheeler, an economist who worked in the OSS and later the State Department. There was William Pearl, who worked in the Treasury Department. What if the entire intelligence apparatus of the United States had been penetrated by Soviet agents? In many ways, it had been. But beyond the specific spies, What's striking about the Venona decrypts is what they reveal about Soviet methodology and American vulnerability. The Soviets targeted ideological believers. They targeted people who had been radicalized during the Great Depression and the rise of fascism in the 1930s. These weren't people motivated primarily by money. They were true believers who thought they were advancing the cause of international communism and preventing fascism from destroying the world. The Soviets were remarkably effective at this kind of recruitment. They would identify Americans with the right ideological sympathies, usually through connections at universities or through leftist organizations. They would meet with them. They would discuss philosophy and politics. They would build relationships. And then, when the moment was right, they would make the pitch. They would ask the person to commit, to actually become an agent, to steal information. Some people said no. Some people were horrified by the direct request, but many said yes, because they genuinely believed they were helping to build a better world. They believed they were striking blows against American imperialism. They believed they were helping the Soviet Union defend itself against capitalist aggression. The Venona decrypts are full of references to these recruits being motivated by ideology. Moscow repeatedly congratulates handlers on their ability to find Americans willing to spy based on ideological commitment rather than money. And here's the thing that's particularly unsettling. Many of these people were intelligent, educated, sophisticated people. They weren't obvious traitors. They didn't fit the stereotype of a spy. They were teachers, scientists, lawyers, diplomats. They were people who could have risen to the highest levels of American government. David Greenglass testified at the Rosenberg trial that Julius had told him that the communists would win because they had science on their side. They had dialectical materialism. They understood history. They were inevitably going to triumph. This was the ideological worldview that motivated many of these spies. They didn't see themselves as traitors. They saw themselves as being on the right side of history. But what if they were wrong? What if instead of advancing the cause of a better world, they were actually enabling Stalin? Stalin, who had killed millions of his own people. Stalin, who would go on to dominate Eastern Europe. Stalin, who would launch wars of conquest and oppression. The irony is that many of these American spies had no idea who they were really serving. They were so far removed from the reality of Soviet totalitarianism that they had constructed an image of the Soviet Union in their minds that bore almost no resemblance to reality. The Venona decrypts occasionally reveal Soviet handlers' frustration with their American sources. The handlers would get messages from Moscow saying things like, "The Americans are becoming concerned that the information they're providing might be used to harm innocent people. Don't lose them. Reassure them that their information is only being used for defensive purposes." So, Soviet handlers would lie to their American sources. They would tell them that the information was being used appropriately, when in fact it was being used to advance Soviet imperial ambitions. Chapter 6, The Question of Alger, his 3,500 words. One of the most famous and controversial figures associated with potential Soviet espionage in the State Department was Alger Hiss. Hiss was a brilliant lawyer and diplomat. He had graduated from Johns Hopkins and Harvard Law School. He had clerked for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He had worked as a lawyer before joining the State Department in 1936. By the early 1940s, he was one of the rising stars of the diplomatic service. He was present at the Yalta Conference in 1945, where he served as an aide to Secretary of State Edward Stettinius. At Yalta, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin met to discuss the post-war arrangement of the world. Yalta is where it was decided that Eastern Europe would fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. Yalta is where agreements were made about Korea, about China, about the structure of the United Nations. And Hiss was in the room, or in the adjoining rooms, during many of these discussions. In the late 1940s, Hiss became the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the most prestigious international affairs organizations in America. He was considered a likely future Secretary of State. Then, in 1948, A former communist named Whittaker Chambers testified before Congress that Hiss had been a member of a communist cell in the State Department. Chambers claimed that Hiss had been stealing government documents and passing them to him, Chambers, who would then pass them to Soviet handlers. Hiss denied this, categorically denied it. He had alleged access to documents that Hiss supposedly gave him, but the documents themselves had supposedly been destroyed. It was a case of one person's word against another's. Hiss sued Chambers for libel. Chambers, rather than admit he couldn't prove his claims, suddenly produced documents. He had hidden some classified State Department documents and typewritten copies of other documents. These documents, Chambers claimed, were the ones that Hiss had given him. The controversy became one of the biggest political scandals of the post-war era. It became a proxy war between left and right. The left defended Hiss. They argued that he was being framed. They argued that Chambers was an unreliable witness. They argued that the documents could have been forged. The right attacked Hiss. They saw him as a symbol of Soviet infiltration of the highest levels of government. In 1950, Hiss was tried for perjury, not espionage, because the statute of limitations for espionage had run out for lying when he denied having given classified documents to Chambers. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial resulted in a conviction. Hiss was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Hiss maintained his innocence for the rest of his life. He died in 1996, still claiming he had been framed. And here's where Venona becomes relevant in a way that was unprecedented. What if we could actually know whether Hiss was guilty or not? When the Venona decrypts were finally declassified in 1995, just a year before Hiss's death, researchers found references to a Soviet spy code named Ailes, who appeared to have been at Yalta. Ailes seemed to have provided information about what happened at Yalta to Soviet handlers after the conference ended. Historians have debated whether Ailes was actually Alger Hiss. The fit isn't perfect. The information in the Venona traffic about Ailes is fragmentary, but the suspicion was certainly raised that Hiss was the source of information about Yalta that Moscow had received. More recently, scholars analyzing the Venona materials have become more confident that Hiss was indeed the source referred to as Ailes. But this revelation came nearly 50 years after Hiss was convicted. For all those decades, Hiss's defenders could argue that he had been falsely accused. They could argue that Chambers was a liar and a tool of right-wing persecution. It wasn't until Venona was declassified that evidence emerged admittedly incomplete and subject to interpretation that suggested Hiss had indeed been a Soviet spy. What if Venona had been declassified in the 1950s instead of the 1990s? Would it have changed the trajectory of American politics? Would it have vindicated McCarthy? Would it have led to even worse repression? Or would it have simply proven that the anti-communist crusade was justified? This is one of the deep historical questions that Venona raises. The secret kept the truth hidden from the American people for decades. But revealing the truth might have had consequences that were themselves problematic. Chapter 7. The Cryptanalytic Triumph, 4200-4900 words. Now, let's talk about the actual code-breaking, because this is where Venona moves from being a story about spies to being a story about technological and intellectual achievement. The problem that the Venona codebreakers faced was genuinely difficult. The Soviet one-time pad cipher was based on a mathematical principle that, if implemented correctly, is theoretically unbreakable. Here's how it worked. A one-time pad is a long, random string of numbers. This random string is used to encrypt a message by adding each digit of the message to each digit of the random string. Because the process uses addition in a special way called modular arithmetic, and because the random string is truly random and used only once, the resulting encrypted message should be impossible to decrypt without knowing the random string. The problem is generating truly random numbers. In the 1940s, the Soviets were generating these random numbers by using mechanical means. They were printing them on paper and distributing them to their operatives. But here's where the oversight came in. The Soviets were distributing duplicate copies of the random number pads to multiple operatives to use for different messages. This was an operational security failure. If the same pad is used twice, if two different messages are encrypted with the same random number pad, then it's theoretically possible to find relationships between the encrypted messages. This is exactly what Cecil Phillips and Jean Grabel realized when they noticed that some Soviet messages appeared to have been encrypted with the same key. Once you have that overlap, the mathematics becomes different. You can't decrypt the individual messages, but you can begin to extract information about what's being encrypted. The Venona team began a process called stripping. They would identify overlapping messages and then mathematically subtract one encrypted text from another. When you subtract two messages that have been encrypted with the same key, the key cancels out in certain positions, and you're left with the difference between the two original messages. This difference still doesn't directly give you the messages, but it gives you constraints. It gives you information about what the possible original text might be. The team would then use linguistic knowledge of Russian to constrain the possibilities further. They knew that Russian was the original language. They knew that Soviet cables would follow certain formats and conventions. They knew about Russian syntax and vocabulary. So they would look for combinations that made linguistic sense in Russian, given the constraints that the mathematical analysis provided. It was detective work, it was mathematics, it was linguistics, it was psychology, because it required understanding how Soviet operatives wrote and what information they would consider important. Painstakingly slow, Meredith Gardner was one of the key figures in this process. By some accounts, Gardner would spend weeks on a single message, working through possibilities, trying different approaches, consulting with colleagues. But gradually, progress was made. By 1946, entire passages were being decrypted. By 1947, whole messages were becoming readable. What if the Venona team had given up? What if they had decided that it was too hard, that it was impossible, and that they should move on to other projects? The entire project could have failed. The Soviet spy network could have continued undetected, but they didn't give up. The breakthrough came with recognizing the overlaps, but the real work was in the sustained, meticulous effort to extract meaning from those overlaps. The team grew over time. By the late 1940s, there were dozens of people working on Venona, though most of them didn't know the full scope of what they were working on. Many of the younger codebreakers thought they were working on a routine cryptanalytic project, breaking Soviet military or diplomatic traffic for intelligence purposes. The full knowledge of what they were finding, evidence of massive Soviet espionage in America, was compartmentalized to a small group at the top. The cryptanalytic work itself was brilliant and represents one of the great achievements of American intelligence and mathematics. In a sense, it was the first time that a one-time pad cipher had been successfully broken through exploitation of operational security failures. The Soviets eventually figured out that their cipher had been compromised. By the early 1950s, they stopped using the vulnerable pads. After that, Venona became less productive because new messages were encrypted with pads that didn't have the overlapping vulnerability. But by then, enough had been decrypted to identify the spy network. The irony is that one of the most secure encryption methods ever designed was defeated not through brilliant mathematical breakthrough, but through a mundane operational security failure. It's a lesson that echoes through the history of cryptography and remains relevant to cybersecurity today. Chapter 8. The decision to keep the secret 4,900-5,600 words. Here's one of the most troubling aspects of the Venona story, the decision to keep it secret from the President and from Congress. President Harry Truman did not know about Venona. Let that sink in for a moment. The code-breaking operation that revealed Soviet espionage at the highest levels of the American government was kept hidden from the President of the United States. Why? The official reason was that revealing Venona would compromise its future value. If the Soviets figured out that America had broken their cipher, they would change their procedures. All future Soviet communications would be secure again. But there's another reason that's rarely discussed. The people running Venona were afraid of what would happen if the president knew about it. Here's the context. Harry Truman had a reputation for being relatively soft on communism compared to his successor, Dwight Eisenhower. Truman believed in negotiating with the Soviets. He believed in containing Soviet expansion, but he wasn't in favor of confrontation. If Truman had known about the full scope of Soviet espionage revealed by Venona, would he have been more aggressive? Would he have pushed for more thorough investigations and prosecutions? The intelligence officials running Venona decided that they would manage the information themselves. They would use Venona to catch spies quietly. They would prosecute those spies when they had sufficient evidence from conventional sources that didn't rely on Venona. But they wouldn't tell the president about Venona itself. This represented an unprecedented situation. American intelligence agencies concealing an entire classified program from the president. The idea that the intelligence community had the power to keep secrets from the chief executive was troubling even to people at the time. And it raises questions that remain relevant today. What right does the intelligence community have to determine what the president should know? What happens when intelligence agencies decide that the president isn't trustworthy enough to be told about their operations? What if Truman had discovered that he had been kept in the dark? In fact, he eventually did find out many years later, after he had left office. One account suggests that years after his presidency, Truman was told about Venona during a private briefing. Truman was reportedly deeply disturbed to learn that such a major intelligence operation had been conducted without his knowledge or consent. But by then, it was too late to do anything about it. The compartmentalization of Venona also had practical consequences for American counterintelligence. Without Venona being publicly known or widely shared, even within the government, FBI investigations into suspected Soviet spies had to rely on evidence that didn't rely on the classified intelligence. This meant that some investigations were hampered. Some spies who should have been caught weren't caught because investigators couldn't use Venona evidence. In other cases, people were prosecuted based on limited evidence when more conclusive evidence was available in Venona, but couldn't be used in court without revealing the program. The Harry Dexter White case is an example of this dilemma. White was suspected by the FBI of being a Soviet agent. But the Bureau didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him. They had suspicions. They had some indirect evidence. But they didn't have a smoking gun, at least not a smoking gun that they could use in court. White maintained his innocence. He was recalled from his government position but was never prosecuted. He died in 1948, still denying he had been a Soviet agent. Only decades later, when Venona was declassified, did clear evidence emerge that White had indeed been a Soviet agent. The Venona decrypts contained references to jurist, which historians have identified as White, and showed him passing information about American financial and economic policy to Moscow. What if White had been prosecuted while he was still alive? Would it have changed public understanding of the Soviet infiltration of government? Would it have vindicated anti-communist crusaders? Instead, White's case remained ambiguous. He died with questions hanging over him. The truth came out only after he was dead and couldn't defend himself. This pattern repeated itself with multiple individuals who were identified in Venona as Soviet spies. Because Venona had to remain secret, the actual evidence of their espionage couldn't be presented. So they either weren't prosecuted, or they were prosecuted with incomplete evidence. The secrecy of Venona created a situation where the truth about the scale and scope of Soviet espionage in America couldn't be publicly established. Chapter 9. The McCarthyism. Paradox 5600-6000. Words. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of the Venona story, the relationship between Venona and McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to national prominence in the early 1950s by claiming that there were communists in the State Department. He made speeches, he held hearings, he accused specific people of being Soviet agents. Most historians agree that McCarthy's methods were reckless and destructive. He made accusations without evidence. He damaged the lives and careers of innocent people. He created a climate of fear and suspicion. But here's the thing. McCarthy was right about the fact that there were Soviet spies in the State Department. McCarthy was making accusations at the same time that Venona was revealing evidence of Soviet espionage in State Department. This creates a historical paradox. McCarthy's conclusions about Soviet infiltration were basically correct, even though his methods were deeply problematic and many of his specific accusations were false or unproven. What if Venona had been declassified in 1952 instead of 1995? If the American public had been able to see the evidence of Soviet espionage revealed by Venona, how would that have affected the McCarthy hearings? Would people have been more sympathetic to McCarthy's anti-communist crusade? Would they have seen his attacks as justified by the actual extent of Soviet espionage? The Venona decrypts do show that some of McCarthy's suspicions were correct. There were indeed communists in the State Department. There were indeed Soviet agents working in American government. But McCarthy's accusation rate was off. He accused hundreds of people. Most of those people were innocent. According to historical accounts, only a handful of McCarthy's specific accusations turned out to be true. So McCarthy was right in general, but wrong in particulars. He was correct that there was a Soviet spy problem, but he was wrong about identifying specific spies. The public debate about McCarthy for decades after his fall in 1954 proceeded without knowledge of Venona. People could argue about whether there really was a Soviet spy problem in America. There was no declassified evidence to point to. McCarthy's accusations remained unresolved. The whole debate became abstract. Then Venona was declassified, and suddenly there was actual evidence. Yes, there were Soviet spies. Yes, the State Department had been penetrated. McCarthy had been onto something. But by then, McCarthy was dead. The anti-communist crusade of the 1950s was seen as a negative chapter in American history. The revelation of Venona felt like a vindication of the paranoia of the McCarthyism era, which was politically uncomfortable for people who had celebrated the end of McCarthyism. The Venona decrypts show that America in the 1940s and 1950s faced a genuine national security threat that had been catastrophically underestimated. The scale of Soviet espionage was larger than anyone outside of the Venona Project realized. The penetration of American government was deeper than anyone outside Venona knew, and the fact that Venona was kept secret meant that the public debate about internal security and communist infiltration proceeded without access to the actual evidence. What if Americans had known in real time about the scope of Soviet espionage? Would public opinion have demanded more aggressive action against communism? Would there have been less McCarthyism, or more? Would have the American response to communist expansion been stronger? We can't know the answer to these counterfactuals, but we can say that the secret nature of Venona distorted the historical record and made the debate about communism and security in 1950s. America fundamentally disconnected from reality. Chapter 10. The Hidden Heroes, 630-6900. Words, the people who worked on the Venona Project were, in many ways, hidden heroes of American security. They were code breakers and mathematicians and linguists. Many of them had advanced degrees. Many of them could have had lucrative careers in academia or private industry. Instead, they chose to work in classified government positions where their accomplishments could never be publicly acknowledged. Meredith Gardner is the most famous of the Venona codebreakers, largely because her role became known after the project was declassified. But during her career, she received no public recognition. She worked in relative obscurity, advancing cryptanalysis and Russian language analysis. Jean Grable was another key figure. She spent decades working on Venona without any expectation that her contributions would ever be publicly known. There were many others whose names have been lost to history: technical specialists, linguists, mathematicians. People who dedicated their careers to work they couldn't talk about, on a project they couldn't acknowledge, toward goals that they couldn't publicly explain. The secrecy extended even to their families. Many Venona workers couldn't tell their spouses what they were doing. They went to work every day at a classified facility and couldn't discuss their work at home. This kind of dedication is rare. This kind of willingness to work toward objectives that you know are important but that you can't share with anyone is a particular kind of patriotism. The Venona team worked through the Cold War, through the Cuban Missile Crisis, through Vietnam, through the 1970s and 1980s, and into the 1990s. They were part of an intelligence operation that spanned 50 years. And then, when they were finally allowed to discuss their work, many of them were already retired or nearing the end of their careers. If you think about what these people did, what they accomplished, it's genuinely remarkable. They broke a cipher that was supposedly unbreakable. They identified hundreds of Soviet agents operating in America. They provided evidence that changed the course of American counterintelligence. And they did it with honor and dedication, and without seeking recognition. The declassification of Venona in 1995 finally allowed these people to receive some acknowledgement of their contributions. Books were written about them, interviews were conducted. Their role in American intelligence history was finally recognized. But for 5 decades, they worked in obscurity. Chapter 11, The Intelligence Failure. That wasn't 16,900, 7,400 words. One way to think about Venona is as an intelligence failure that was ultimately prevented. The Soviet intelligence service successfully penetrated American government at multiple levels. They recruited hundreds of Americans. They obtained information about America's military capabilities, diplomatic intentions, and scientific achievements. They knew what America was planning before America knew what America was planning, in some cases. This was a massive intelligence and counterintelligence failure. But the failure was partially corrected by the American cryptanalytic breakthrough. Venona allowed America to understand the scope of the infiltration and to begin to address it. However, by the time Venona was providing actionable intelligence, the most sensitive information had already been stolen. Atomic bomb secrets had already been passed to Moscow. Diplomatic cables from Yalta had already been compromised. American military intelligence had already been penetrated. The Soviets obtained their information during the early and middle years of World War II and the first few years after the war. By the time America was reading Soviet cables about the espionage, the damage had already been done. This is a hard historical truth. Soviet espionage operations in America during the 1940s were phenomenally successful. They obtained information that allowed Stalin to better understand American intentions toward the Soviet Union. They obtained information about American military capabilities. They obtained information about atomic weapons. All of this information contributed to Soviet decision-making about post-war strategy. What if Venona had existed earlier? What if America had been able to break Soviet cipher during World War II while the espionage was happening? What if America had been able to identify Soviet spies and stop them while they were actively stealing information? The history of World War II and the Cold War might have been different. Soviet intelligence might have operated with less confidence, knowing that America could read their cables. American security might have been tightened. Soviet agents might have been rolled up before they could steal sensitive information. But Venona didn't exist earlier. It took years to develop. It took the discovery of the overlapping keys. It took the sustained effort of brilliant code breakers to make progress. By the time Venona was operational, by the time it was decrypting meaningful information, much of the damage was already done. This is a reminder that in intelligence and security, timing matters. An intelligence operation that arrives too late, even if it's brilliant and successful, might not prevent the catastrophe it was designed to prevent. The Venona team did everything right. They made breakthroughs that shouldn't have been possible. They decrypted information that was supposed to be secure. They identified spies who were supposed to remain hidden. But they did it too late to stop the initial damage. Is this an intelligence failure or an intelligence success? The answer is both. It's a success in terms of the technical accomplishment and the eventual identification of the spy network. It's a failure in the sense that it didn't prevent the theft of sensitive information that had already occurred. Chapter 12. The Shadow over the Cold War 7400-7900. Words. The Venona revelations, when they were finally publicized in the 1990s, cast a long shadow backward across the history of the Cold War. Historians had to reconsider their understanding of Cold War diplomacy. If Soviet diplomats knew what American negotiators were planning before negotiations began, if Soviet leaders had intelligence about American capabilities and intentions, how did that affect the course of the Cold War? The strategic weapons limitation talks of the 1970s, for instance. What information did the Soviets have about American nuclear weapons? What advantages did that information give them? The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. What did the Soviets know about American military capabilities? What did they know about American decision-making processes? Did Soviet espionage provide intelligence that influenced Soviet decisions during the crisis, the Vietnam War? What information did the Soviets have about American strategy and capabilities in Southeast Asia? How did that information affect Soviet support for North Vietnam? These are questions that historians are still debating in light of Venona. What we know is that the Soviet Union had better intelligence about America than America realized. Soviet leaders had inside information. Soviet decision-makers knew things about America that America was trying to keep secret. This created an asymmetry. The Cold War was supposed to be a competition between two systems, two ideologies, two superpowers. But if one side had significantly better intelligence about the other, the competition was tilted. How much of American Cold War strategy was based on assumptions that the Soviets had already undermined through espionage? This is an unsettling question, because it suggests that American intelligence and defense decision-makers were making strategic decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information about what the Soviets knew. For instance, American military planners might have assumed that Soviet leaders were uncertain about American military capabilities, when in fact Soviet leaders had detailed information from American spies. This could have led American planners to make different strategic choices than they would have made if they had known that their secrets had been compromised. The revelation of Venona and the realization of the scope of Soviet espionage raised uncomfortable questions about American security during the Cold War. But it also provided historians with evidence that allowed them to reassess the period with more complete information. Chapter 13. The Legacy of Venona, 7900-8500. Words. What is the lasting impact of the Venona Project? How has it shaped American intelligence and security in the decades since its declassification? First, Venona demonstrated the vulnerability of cryptographic systems that are implemented improperly. The Soviet one-time pad cipher was theoretically unbreakable, but because of operational security failures, because copies of the pads were duplicated and reused, the system was compromised. This lesson has been incorporated into modern cryptography and security protocols. The understanding that even mathematically secure systems can be vulnerable if not implemented correctly has influenced how modern security systems are designed and managed. Second, Venona showed the extent to which a foreign power could penetrate American government if security procedures weren't strictly followed. This led to reforms in American counterintelligence practices and security clearance procedures. The scandal of Soviet espionage revealed by Venona led to more rigorous investigation of potential security threats. It led to more careful monitoring of communications with foreign powers. It contributed to the establishment of more formal counterintelligence protocols. Third, Venona provided evidence that changed historical understanding of the Cold War. When Venona was declassified, it vindicated some claims made by anti-communist figures in the 1950s. and raised questions about whether McCarthy-era concerns about communist infiltration had been justified. This led to historical revisionism. Some historians who had dismissed concerns about communist infiltration as paranoid hysteria had to reconsider their positions in light of Venona evidence. This doesn't mean that McCarthy was justified or that McCarthyism wasn't destructive, but it does mean that the historical record became more complicated. The assumption that American security concerns in the 1950s were entirely unfounded was proven to be wrong. The lesson: sometimes the paranoid accusations turn out to have a kernel of truth, even if the specific targets of the accusations are wrong. Fourth, Venona has influenced contemporary debates about security and surveillance. In the post-9/11 era, when the United States government implemented extensive surveillance programs to try to prevent terrorist attacks, supporters of these programs cited Venona as an example of the kind of intelligence operation that could detect threats before they strike. The argument was, Venona shows that foreign intelligence services can successfully penetrate American government if we're not vigilant. Therefore, extensive surveillance is justified as a countermeasure to prevent similar infiltration in the modern era. Critics, on the other hand, pointed out that Venona was an example of classified intelligence operations being conducted without appropriate oversight or public debate. They argued that Venona was an example of why secret surveillance programs are problematic. They can lead to abuses and lack of accountability. So Venona has become a touchstone in debates about the balance between security and liberty. What does the Venona story tell us about how governments balance security concerns with the need for transparency and democratic accountability? This is a question that remains deeply relevant today. Chapter 14, Final Reflections, 8,500, 9,200 words. It also represents one of the most troubling episodes in the history of American government accountability. The achievement is undeniable. American cryptanalysts broke a cipher that was supposed to be unbreakable. They identified hundreds of Soviet spies. They provided evidence that was instrumental in changing American understanding of the Cold War. But the secrecy that surrounded Venona, the decision to keep it hidden from the president, the compartmentalization that prevented this knowledge from becoming public, all of this raises questions about the proper role of intelligence agencies in a democratic society. In a democracy, citizens are supposed to be the ultimate repository of power. The government is supposed to serve the people. Intelligence agencies are created to serve the government and ultimately the people. But Venona represents a situation where intelligence agencies concealed information from the government and from the people. They made decisions about what the nation should or shouldn't know. They determined that the president didn't need to know about a major intelligence operation. What happens when intelligence agencies decide they know better than elected officials about what should be classified or declassified? This is a question that goes beyond Venona. It's a question about the proper structure of government and the relationship between the intelligence community and political leadership. The people running Venona believed they were making the right decision by keeping it secret from the president. They believed that revealing Venona would compromise its future usefulness. They believed that they were acting in the national interest. But they also weren't elected. They weren't accountable to the people. They weren't subject to the same checks and balances as elected officials. When unelected officials can make decisions about what elected officials and the public should know, something important about democratic governance is compromised. This doesn't mean that all classification is problematic. There are genuine national security reasons for classified information. But there's a difference between keeping operational details classified and keeping an entire program hidden from the president. What if there had been more transparency about Venona? What if the president had been told? What if Congress had been told? What if the American people had been told about the Soviet spy network that had been uncovered? Perhaps the outcome would have been worse. Perhaps more aggressive action against communism would have led to repression. Perhaps revealing Venona would have created a public panic. Or perhaps the outcome would have been better. Perhaps the public would have understood the actual scope of the threat. Perhaps decisions about American security and foreign policy would have been made with more complete information. Perhaps McCarthy would have been able to make his case more effectively. We don't know what would have happened. But we can say that the secrecy created a situation where the truth about Soviet espionage in America was hidden from those who should have known it. And that's troubling. The story of Venona is a story of remarkable human achievement combined with troubling questions about government accountability. It's a story about how brilliant people can accomplish seemingly impossible things. But it's also a story about how those accomplishments can be tainted by the secrecy that surrounds them. As we face modern security challenges, as we make decisions about surveillance and classified information and the proper role of intelligence agencies, the Venona story offers lessons that are worth considering. Chapter 15. Connecting to the Modern World 9200-9800. Words. Words in 2020 challenges than it did in the 1940s, but the fundamental questions that Venona raises remain relevant. Today, we worry about cyber espionage. We worry about foreign intelligence services hacking into American computer systems. We worry about the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. We worry about election interference. Just as the Soviet Union in the 1940s was trying to understand American capabilities and intentions through espionage, foreign powers today are trying to do the same through cyber means. The difference is that in the 1940s, espionage required human agents. It required recruiting Americans to steal documents and pass them to foreign handlers. It was a slow process and a labor-intensive process. Today, espionage can be conducted digitally. Hackers can steal millions of documents in a matter of hours. They don't need human agents. They don't need to recruit Americans. They can operate from outside the United States entirely. In some ways, this makes the threat less serious. It's harder for a foreign power to influence American policy if they're hacking computers rather than recruiting spies at the highest levels of government. But in other ways, it makes the threat more serious. Cyber espionage can be conducted on a much larger scale. It can target not just government, but also private companies. It can steal not just diplomatic cables, but also commercial secrets and personal information. How would Venona work in the modern age? If the United States discovered today that the Chinese government had successfully hacked into American government computer systems and was reading American emails, what would be the appropriate response? The Venona team kept the secret because they wanted to keep using it. They wanted to keep reading Soviet cables even after they knew the cipher had been compromised. That made sense in the context of intelligence work, but it also meant that the truth about Soviet espionage was hidden from the American people for decades. Modern cryptography is much more sophisticated than Soviet one-time pads. American cyber defenses are more robust, but foreign powers continue to try to penetrate American computer systems. They continue to attempt to steal secrets. And the fundamental question remains, if America discovers that a foreign power is successfully stealing secrets, what should America do with that information? Should it keep the discovery secret to avoid alerting the foreign power, or should it go public to alert the American people to the threat? The answer depends on factors that are debated by security experts and government officials. But Venona provides historical perspective on how such decisions have been made and the consequences those decisions have had. In 2006, the American intelligence community publicly attributed Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee to the Russian government. This was a decision to go public with classified intelligence. It was a decision to reveal what American intelligence agencies knew about Russian cyber espionage. This decision was controversial. Critics argued that it politicized intelligence. Supporters argued that it was necessary to inform the American people about foreign interference in the electoral process. What would have happened if the government had kept that information classified? The American people might not have known that their election had been targeted by a foreign power. The debate about Russian interference might not have happened. American politics might have followed a different trajectory. You, me. On the other hand, revealing classified intelligence about how the government had discovered the hacking might have compromised intelligence methods or revealed vulnerabilities that would allow Russia to conduct hacking more successfully in the future. These are the same trade-offs that the Venona team had to make: security versus transparency, operational effectiveness versus democratic accountability. The Venona story doesn't provide clear answers to these questions, but it provides historical context that makes the questions more concrete. Chapter 16. Conclusion. The White of Secrets, 9,800-1,000 words. The Venona Project, declassified in 1995, more than 50 years after it began, revealed that America had been far more vulnerable to Soviet espionage than the public had realized. The Soviet Union had successfully penetrated American government at the highest levels. They had recruited hundreds of Americans. They had obtained information about American military capabilities and diplomatic intentions. The revelation of Venona vindicated those who had warned about communist infiltration and raised uncomfortable questions about whether Cold War concerns about Soviet espionage had been more justified than post-war revisionism suggested. But the Venona story also raises troubling questions about government secrecy and the proper role of intelligence agencies in a democracy. The men and women who worked on Venona were heroes. They accomplished something remarkable. They broke an unbreakable cipher. They identified a massive spy network. They served their country with dedication and distinction, but they did it in secret. They did it without public recognition. They did it in a way that hid the truth about Soviet espionage from the American people. Was this the right decision? The answer isn't simple. In one sense, keeping Venona secret was probably necessary from an operational standpoint. If the Soviets had known that their cipher had been broken, they would have changed their procedures. All future intelligence gathered through Venona would have ceased. In another sense, keeping Venona secret prevented the American people from understanding the actual scope of the threat they faced. It prevented elected officials from making decisions based on complete information. It allowed an entire historical period to be debated and analyzed by scholars who didn't have access to the most important evidence. This is the fundamental tension: operational security versus democratic transparency. Intelligence agencies argue that they need to keep secrets in order to be effective. They argue that if foreign powers know how America is gathering intelligence, they will change their behavior to avoid that intelligence. They argue that revealing sources and methods compromises future intelligence operations. But Democrats argue that keeping secrets from the public and from elected officials undermines democratic accountability. They argue that citizens and their representatives have a right to know what their government is doing. They argue that transparency is necessary to prevent government abuse. Venona represents a case where these two imperatives were in fundamental tension. The evidence suggests that the Venona team made decisions based on what they thought was best for American security. They weren't trying to undermine democracy or prevent accountability. They were trying to protect an intelligence operation that they believed was crucial to national security. But the fact remains that they kept secrets from the president and from the American people. And for decades, historical debate about communism and Cold War security proceeded without access to the most important evidence. The lesson of Venona isn't that secrecy is always wrong or that transparency is always right. The lesson is that secrets have consequences. They shape history. They influence political debate. They affect how people understand their own nation and their own history. When the Venona Project was finally declassified, it changed how historians understood the Cold War. It provided evidence that vindicated some arguments and contradicted others. It made historical questions that had seemed settled suddenly open again. What does this tell us about the power of secrets? Secrets determine what we know about our history. They influence what becomes part of the historical record and what remains hidden. They shape the narrative that we tell about ourselves as a nation. The Venona Project reveals that for 50 years, America was telling itself a story about its past that was incomplete. The true story, the story of massive Soviet infiltration of American government, the story of hundreds of American spies passing secrets to Moscow, was classified. So, the nation's understanding of its own history was based on partial information. As we look forward, as we make decisions about what to classify and what to declassify, what to tell the public and what to keep secret, the Venona story offers a warning. Secrets have power. They shape how we understand ourselves and our nation. They influence political decisions and historical understanding. They can protect national security, but they can also prevent necessary democratic debate. The balance between security and transparency is one of the fundamental challenges of modern democratic governance. The Venona Project is a case study in how difficult that balance can be, and what happens when security concerns are allowed to completely override transparency and accountability. The people who worked on Venona were dedicated patriots who served their country brilliantly. Their accomplishment in breaking Soviet cryptography was genuinely remarkable. Their identification of the Soviet spy network was a crucial counterintelligence success. But the secrecy that surrounded their work also means that for decades, American public discourse about communism and security proceeded without access to the most important evidence. The shadow of Venona reminds us that history is not fixed or settled. As new information is revealed, our understanding of the past changes. And that means we must remain humble about how much we think we know about history, about politics, about our own nation. The Venona Project is a story of American achievement and American mystery. It's a story of brilliant people doing extraordinary work in the service of their country. It's also a story about the weight of secrets and the consequences of keeping truth hidden from the people whose history is being shaped. As we face modern security challenges, as we make decisions about what should be classified and what should be public, the Venona story reminds us that these decisions matter. They matter to national security, but they also matter to historical truth and democratic governance. The ultimate lesson of Venona isn't about communism or Cold War strategy. It's about the fundamental importance of balancing security with accountability, of protecting necessary secrets while ensuring that the people have access to the information they need to make informed decisions about their own nation. That balance remains one of the central challenges of a free society.